Professor Hanson, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. In understanding the global patrimonial wave, you discussed the resurgence of patrimonial rule. How does Trump's presidency fit into this framework, and what long-term effects might his style of governance have on the American democracy?
Well, thanks for this question. I want to begin by acknowledging my co-author, Jeffrey Kopstein, who, of course, can't join us on this interview, but everything we've done together is a complete 50-50 product. So I always begin by acknowledging his great work. Well, we do think, sadly, that our predictions in the global patrimonial wave and in the assault on the state, the book we've just published, have sadly come true. The Trump administration in its early weeks has fulfilled these predictions practically to a T. We think that our warning, unfortunately, was quite prescient. Now, what did we see in a way coming down the road? We argued that this new version of patrimonial rule is really a wave of the entire 21st century, and quite unexpected, because the old literature on patrimonialism, or neo-patrimonialism as it was often called, assumed it was a relic of traditional society that would be destined to be overthrown by modernity. And you might get sort of periods of patrimonial interludes, particularly in the developing world, but nobody had predicted patrimonialism of the 19th century sort, or even earlier sorts, in countries like US, Israel, UK, much of Central and Eastern Europe, and now threatening the world. So, we'll talk more, I'm sure, in the interview about the details of the Trump administration, but the key features are that the ruler rules the entire state as if it were his personal possession, that he sees the state as a family business of sorts, that he hands out pieces of the state and protection of the state to loyalists, to cronies, and to family members directly, and that he attacks the impersonal and impartial administration of the state as a block on his arbitrary form of power. All of that comes directly from Max Weber, and in a way, we're just applying Weber's analysis to these unexpected 21st century cases.
You highlight how strong bureaucratic institutions played a key role in managing the COVID-19 pandemic. How did the Trump administration's approach to governance impact the US response to the crisis? And do you see lasting damage to state capacity?
Yeah, we talk about this a lot in both the book, but especially in the article. And what we argue is that patrimonial style politics is really terrible for handling things like global pandemics. In general, the public good is the first casualty of patrimonialism because it isn't about the public, it's about the private will of the ruler. And so you get terrible performances if you look comparatively and statistically in countries like Russia under Putin. Trump's US performs very poorly. Other patrimonial states have this combination of distrust in the state, which of course inhibits people's willingness to get vaccines and to trust the experts who produce them, but also the kind of arbitrariness of the ruler. Appearances on television like the ones Trump made, where he seems to endorse sunlight as a cure for COVID, or at one point seeming to suggest people inject bleach in front of his expert advisors. And that did play a role in the excess death toll in the US as compared to, for example, Canada, that did much better. Now, there are countries with patrimonial style rulers that did well in certain aspects of dealing with the pandemic. You think of the Operation Warp Speed under Trump, where the vaccine was created very quickly, or Netanyahu's vaccination campaigns in Israel that were quite effective. But we argue that's taking advantage of the past legacies of state building. The experts and the state capacity that existed before these rulers is deployed by the ruler in the crisis. And for a while, you can rely on those experts and those doctors and those facilities. But of course, if you erode the state too much over time, you won't have that in the future.
Right. Your work discusses the global trend of leaders undermining bureaucratic institutions. How does Trump's presidency exemplify this? And what challenges does this pose for future administrations attempting to restore trust and expertise?
Yeah, I mean, the book, of course, is called The Assault on the State. And so I think one reason it's now getting some attention is that the title does encapsulate what we expected to happen under Trump. Maybe this extent of the assault on the state is a surprise even to us. It's not just an attack on the so-called deep state as a sort of rhetorical device, but an actual effort to dismantle the entirety of the US federal government with DOGE, the sort of agency created out of the blue and directed by Elon Musk in all but name. is now going into every single state agency in the United States. They have really very young people from the ages of 18 to 25 embedded in the agencies, looking at files, looking at personnel issues, looking at flows of money. And while there's been a little bit of an effort lately to cut that back because of the anger actually of Trump's cabinet ministers, it's still in place. And the damage that that's going to do to long-term state capacity is really incalculable. So all of that again fits, but in an extreme form. And I'll say one thing that might be actually a bit surprising and perhaps even in a weird way good for those of us who want to restore the state is that this is happening so quickly that the damaging effects will be seen sooner rather than later. And if that happens, maybe public opposition can also be mobilized more quickly.
Right. You argue that traditional democracy/autocracy classifications are insufficient. Given Trump's attempts to subvert democratic norms, where would you place his presidency within your broader conceptual framework?
Yeah, one of the arguments in the book that's been actually a little bit controversial, I'd say, and difficult to get across to people is that we really don't think that the democracy-autocracy divide is adequate to understand this phenomenon. And it's in all of our heads. It is the common way that political scientists and social scientists and journalists too think about regime. When you say regime type now in political science, people say, okay, that's a scale. It's measured by VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy group, or it's measured by polity, or it's measured by Freedom House. But in each case, there's a line. And the line goes from, positive to negative, with positive being the most democratic, negative being the most autocratic. And one reason I think we failed to pick up this phenomenon of patrimonialism early is that it doesn't fit that scheme. You can have free and fair elections over and over again, actually, and patrimonial style rulers can win them. In some cases, they really like those elections. They're pretty good at them. Trump is a great example of that. Boris Johnson is another case. Appealing to the kind of tropes of populism, which does play a role in the electoral campaigns, and bringing in the machismo that patrimonial leaders try to exemplify, and railing against the so-called deep state bureaucracy, Brussels in the case of anti-EU politicians. All of that has a certain popular appeal. And so these folks can win elections quite handily. If they do, then it's a really difficult thing to say, well, you're actually anti-democratic because you just won the election, we understand, but really you're anti-democratic. So the axis has to change. Our analysis has to shift to the second axis, which we say is between impersonal state governance and personalized state governance. We take this from Weberian sociology, of course. If this is a truly independent axis, what it implies is that there are 4 regime types, not just 2. You can have bureaucratically rational democracies. Denmark comes to mind, classic European cases, or Canada, let's say. You can have personalized democracies, which are patrimonial, and that's the US case today under Trump. And you can also, of course, have personalized autocracy, which is quite common, and bureaucratic autocracy, the sort of Singapore model or the Rechtsstaat in the 19th century. So if that sort of 2x2 chart works, what we have to get used to is that the patrimonial style can play a role in democratic polities without immediately destroying their democratic nature. You can even have cases like Philippines, where in effect, you get to choose which patrimonial clan will rule patrimonially. It could be the Duterte group, it could be the Marcos family, but either way, you've got kind of the same style. And so there are all sorts of combinations like that we haven't anticipated, I'd say, in our sort of standard political science.
Right. Trump's refusal to accept the 2020 election results mirrors tactics used by patrimonial rulers. How does this compare to other historical or global cases, and what risks does it pose for future US elections?
Yeah, well, connecting to what we just talked about, the January 6th events and Trump's unwillingness to admit defeat is a little bit unusual in these cases. And the reason for that is either you have pretty clear-cut electoral victory. Orban, wins these elections that really propel him to absolute power in Hungary. He gets a parliamentary supermajority that allows him to amend the Constitution. Over time, the space for democratic competition clearly erodes, but it's done through legal ways. He's not forced to say all of it was fake, because in fact he won. There's, maybe some elements of this with Boris Johnson's defeat, where he's a little bit reluctant to let go and, continues to complain after the fact that this was somehow engineered by somebody, but he never actually said that he, deserved to be ruler forever. And of course, he went out through parliamentary means, not through an election. So in this respect, Trump saying, I never lost the election, it was all rigged, and it was all the deep state blocking it, is a bit unusual, I would say, in the annals of these kinds of regime types. It's certainly played a big role, though, in continuing the undermining of trust in state institutions in the United States, in undermining the trust in voting, counting, and the electronic ballot boxes that are often used. And that is a serious issue going forward because, while I said earlier, you can have patrimonial democracy and it can be actually, competitive, it does erode the quality of democracy over time if everybody believes the ballot box is rigged and the votes are fake, because eventually you can convince your supporters you won when you really lost. And obviously that can lead to even worse regime outcomes.
All right. Your research connects US political shifts to broader global patterns. Does Trump's rise signal a deeper systematic failure in Western democracies? And how can the US counteract this trend moving forward?
Yeah, it's definitely a bad situation. And we should add, Jeff and I are definitely in favor of democracy too. Sometimes we get asked this question, you're so concerned about the state. Would you rather have a Rechtsstaat with no democracy, than a democracy that's kind of patrimonial in some ways? And the answer to that question is that we don't have to make that choice. I mean, the reality right now is that there's no Rechtsstaat or Singapore uncorrupted autocracy on offer. I mean, the only versions on offer now are populism in the democratic context and patrimonialism in the state context versus the old forms of liberal rational legal order, to use Weber's terminology. So, part of our goal is to reclaim the state as a positive entity. We've had it bashed for so long on the left and the right. Libertarians say the state is a block to liberty. On the left, you have people who see the military-industrial complex as a surveillance state, also blocking the people's will. You have religious nationalists who think the state is too secular and is stamping out the practice of religious life. And that's true, by the way, in places like Russia as well as the US. So it's different religious traditionalisms, but with the same kind of complaint. The idea that the secular modern state is a good thing and helps protect the public welfare by and large is often missing from our political discourse. You sound like you're sort of defending an old discredited status quo, but we should notice it's not actually the status quo. That's the whole problem. And this connects to another issue. We are definitely in the camp that says that neoliberalism has a lot to answer for over the last 30 years. The idea that the state should somehow be reconstructed in the service of markets, that it should be, downsized as much as possible to become more efficient, that the old welfare state was truly bloated and somehow not effective. Those kinds of arguments, we think, did a lot of damage, particularly when there was such a disastrous result in the 2008 and then the 2010 to 11 financial crises around the world. That did convince a lot of people that the neoliberal order the meritocrats were not meritocratic and the experts weren't experts. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't care about ordinary people. So now the task is to say that actually was not the welfare state. That was not the old establishment. That was a new group who came in thinking the establishment was inefficient and wanted to rip the state apart in some way. Returning to the state as a source of public goods and as a defender of public goods actually takes us not back to the neoliberals, it takes us back earlier. And it means reclaiming the idea that the people can own the state, that state can be democratic. It can truly be, ironically, Republican in the sense of a public thing that ordinary citizens own and connect to.
Right. In the assault on the state, you argue that modern government is under attack. How does Trump's presidency exemplify this trend, particularly regarding the erosion of democratic institutions and bureaucratic expertise?
Yeah, I mean, what's going on in my country right now is painful to watch for those of us who are closely connected to the production of expertise in the country. I mean, I'm a university professor, and many of our students and graduate students go on directly to jobs in the federal government. They do things like work on climate change. They do things like secure our military bases against the flooding that now will hit many of them. They work in the public health arena and get ready for the next pandemic and test the next vaccines. And it's hard sometimes to convince young people to join public service from universities, even before the Trump administration. You know, people say, well, I can make more money in the private sector, and the public sector might be a little bit too slow for me, and there's all these processes I have to go through to get there. But nevertheless, we managed to get a certain number of really brilliant young people every year to go commit their entire lives to this public service that's so quickly attacked. Now it will be almost impossible. First of all, right now, no one would join the federal government. You'd be crazy because they're downsizing every office, and there's going to be, you know, massive, massive layoffs. But even going forward, how do you convince people this will never happen again? How do you get people to invest for years in degrees and in, you know, lower stages of employment in the government when they can't it could be that the next president will come in and fire everybody again. So the damage is much more severe than just a single administration. That's the negative. It's a really serious problem. US is a most extreme case perhaps, but there are versions of this in every patrimonial case. You can take a look at the Tusk government in Poland. I mean, they've been struggling to try to restore trust in the judiciary, for example, and to deal with changes in the judiciary made by the Peace Party. It's not easy to reverse. The old joke is that it's a lot easier to turn an aquarium into fish soup than it is to turn fish soup into an aquarium. And the destruction of the state leaves you with a big mess that takes years to overcome. So I do think that we have to be very realistic about the crisis that we face, and we have to, again, start with first principles. We're not going to fix this just by an election or two. We, meaning those of us who care about democratic states that provide public goods in the modern world, which I hope is a lot of people, are going to have to start with education and collective action and countering this really disastrous attack on some things that matter a lot.
All right. Trump frequently positioned himself against the deep state, portraying government institutions as adversaries. To what extent do you see this rhetoric as a deliberate political strategy versus a genuine ideological stance?
Yeah, I don't think patrimonial rulers are best understood as ideological. It's the big difference between patrimonialism and fascism, certainly versus Nazism. So people like Hitler, people like Mussolini, they had ideologies. They had visions of the future. You could say that they were crackpot visions of the future or evil. Certainly they were. But the argument was, we know where we're leading this new empire, and it will be, either racially pure, or it will be a resurrection of Roman virtue. We'll get young people to imbibe this spirit. They will march in step, mobilized. In the case of patrimonialism, the tendency is to demobilize society. And that was true of the old Tsar-style version as well, older monarchies. Non-ideological regimes that say, let the ruler take care of the state. It's his personal possession, gender intended. And so ordinary people, the narod in Russian, the kind of mass, aren't supposed to have a connection to the state, which is the opposite of fascism and mobilizational ideology. When you get to Trump himself, clearly there's no ideology there. He's shifted on all sorts of positions. But people make the mistake of thinking that means he has no center at all. He does. His center is that he alone can fix it. He is the anointed, and now he thinks kind of God-anointed ruler of America's patrimony, and the state belongs to him. And that actually is a consistent theme. So one doesn't have to just say, every tweet contradicts the previous one or every X. It's not quite the case. The consistent themes underlying everything is loyalty is the most important currency. And if you're not perfectly loyal, I'll punish you. The deep state, who have expertise in impersonal legal norms, are actually fakers and need to be destroyed. And the US itself should be treated as the property of the ruling party, of the ruling state, and of the ruling household, I should say, including the Trump family. And now you see even the imperial connotations that often were the case historically with patrimonialism, claims on territory that are meant somehow to be historically part of the patrimony of the ruler. You see that with Putin's claims, obviously, on Ukraine, but now you begin to see it with Trump's claims on places like Canada or Greenland or Panama.
Right. Your studies highlight how distrust in government is often fueled by misinformation. How did Trump's presidency contribute to this, and what long-term effects do you foresee on public trust in US institutions?
Yeah, it really is a big part of the problem. No question, social media, the internet more generally, the decline of local newspapers, and again, the decline of trust in the so-called legacy media has made it much more difficult to get a coherent message out that, not everybody would agree to, but at least sort of the elites in the local politics of each state in the US, of each major city. Back in the day, it was impossible to make a completely incredible claim with no factual basis and have it be repeated by media outlets all over the United States. Could never have happened because not only did you have professional journalists reporting in each locality, but you even had a fairness doctrine before the Reagan administration in which if you made one claim, you had to have equal space for the other claim. These sound like quaint notions now, but we need to return to them. Actually, restoring the fairness doctrine would go a long way. I don't know how you would enforce it in our current environment, but imagine that any podcaster or any news show that puts some outrageous claim out there, all of the election machines are rigged, had to have equal time for somebody right afterward who said, actually, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. And the people who claim that have been thoroughly debunked. People are not hearing in real time the other point of view. They're only hearing their own point of view. And that clearly makes it hard. I will say one last sort of comparative thing, which is if you look at the history of failed democracy in the past, it's not just social media that's to blame. Weimar Germany famously fell into polarized parties and polarization of society in a form that couldn't pass budgets and ultimately led to the autocratic outcomes in Weimar and ultimately Nazism. And all of that happened well before social media or the internet. It's not the only way that societies break down, but it does exacerbate the situation when polarization begins, precisely because each part of the polarized society finds its own media outlets and repeats its own echo chamber and distrusts all the others.
Right. You discussed the global assault on modern governance. In what ways did Trump's administration mirror or influence similar moments in countries like Hungary, Brazil, or the UK under Brexit leadership?
Yeah, the question of where it began is part of our book, and we make the claim that people found hard to believe, that we really stand by it. It started with Putin. And we do this partly through chronology. I mean, if you look carefully at the evidence before the rise of Putin in 2000 and then, the decades after that, you had populism, of course, as you know better than anybody. There were plenty of populist movements in Europe. And they would sort of rise on the far right or on the far left. They would have sometimes parliamentary representation. They could, make it difficult to form coalitions in parliaments, but they could never form governments. They were either systematically excluded from governments by pacts by the mainstream parties, or they just never achieved the electoral ability to do it. The one breakthrough prior to Putin is Berlusconi and Forza Italia, which, he does become prime minister for a brief moment in the 90s. But it's the exception that proves the rule, because he loses power quickly after that. And it's only after 2000, with a very close alliance with Putin, by the way, that the Berlusconi regime, so to speak, begins to take on sort of the more familiar patrimonial features. So we place a lot of emphasis on Putin's example. We think it's emulation, as well as, of course, some direct support. It's true that the Putin regime has funded pro-Russian parties all over the world, all over Europe. They have definitely funded misinformation that is in the interests of the Russian Federation, of the Russian increasingly imperial state. Brexit, as we know, was parliamentary commission in UK concluded that the Russian role in disinformation did matter. And so, it's not as if Moscow's been passive in this process. Having said that, the big factor we think is simply people looking at it and saying, it never occurred to us before you could build a 19th century style state in the 21st century. But look what the guy's done. People thought Russia was finished, to quote a famous headline from 2001. People thought Russia was a laughingstock. Everyone, the IR, international relations realists, all ignored it. And yet he became, once again, the ruler of a great power that could influence events far around the world in places like Syria, let's say, in US elections. And those who hated the liberal center, mostly on the right, but some on the left even, began to say, whatever's going on in Russia, we have to figure it out, because the guy has shown we no longer have to listen to the experts. We can beat the technocrats, and we can have the restoration of traditional forms of machismo, of religious veneration, and of hierarchy. All of that played a huge role. For Orban, let me just say, it's clear, the emulation factor is very direct. And for people like Netanyahu, too, emulation of this model is easy to trace. So, these are empirical links, not just speculation. People were surprised, and now I think a little less surprised with the recent events in the Trump administration dealing with the invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly people are asking us, did you say really Russia was, the starting point for this? Yes.
Right. Even after his presidency, Trump's influence may remain strong in shaping Republican politics. Do you see the attack on modern government as a continuing movement? And how might a second Trump term escalate these trends?
And I'm hoping when you say a second Trump term, you mean this one,
Yes.
not the one that would come after. There's already a lot of talk about amending the Constitution in the United States or reinterpreting it in such a way that he would be able to serve again after this. Very reminiscent of Putin discussions in the 2000s when he had to overcome his official 4-year term limit in the Russian Constitution, first by putting his prime minister in place and then, just basically changing the Constitution to rule forever. These kinds of discussions matter for your question because, obviously these people first have to be defeated. They have to leave office. As long as they're in, the patrimonial style will remain an absolutely critical factor, as everyone in the world can now see. And this is a problem when even China under Xi Jinping, although it's still a Leninist state with Leninist institutions, increasingly itself has patrimonial features, with Xi Jinping posing as the father of the nation and asserting patrimonial rights to territories around China. When you have China and the United States and Russia, and we can add, elements in Turkey and in India and in Brazil, as you mentioned, though Lula maybe a little less so than Bolsonaro, so many great powers have gone this direction that it's very tricky for the Macrons and the Merzes and the Starmers and, those who are still in the other camp to figure out how on earth they're going to protect what's left. So that's the immediate problem, is just figuring out how do you win in this incredibly lopsided world situation in favor of patrimonialism. The longer term question we talked about earlier, which is restoring some vision for the future of what a liberal state could look like. In the US, you can't say liberal anymore either because it sounds like some liberal, leftist, radical, all the Marxist, it's all sort of put together in a clump. So there's incredibly long and hard rhetorical and mobilizational work to do to recruit people, ordinary citizens, to fight this stuff on the grounds that it doesn't help their public welfare, that it doesn't help them integrate into a society that's fair, that's not corrupt, that works with integrity, that can actually take seriously public opinion. I mean, all of those things depend on the modern state, and now is the time to spread the word.
And lastly, Professor Hanson, if modern governance is indeed under siege, what steps can be taken either by policymakers, scholars, or civil society to rebuild public trust in democratic institutions and counter the assault on the state?
Well, and we were beginning to speak about this. It's the question that we really have to all engage together. We end the book by saying that we think proper diagnosis helps on its own. So one of the things is just to get people to understand that it's the state that's under assault, and democracy too in the longer term, because if you don't have a modern state, eventually you can't really run elections freely and fairly. You don't have the impersonal procedures to count the votes, fairly. You'll have what you have in Russia, which is political pressure to produce vote totals that show the leader to have received 90% or 80% or some absurd total. And, that isn't democracy. So we're not saying that the erosion of democracy too isn't a problem. It is quite a problem, but it's a bit longer term. And the short-term problem is this destruction of the capacity of the state that's going on in the US and in some other cases as well. What can we do about it then? So diagnosis, number one, figuring out that this itself is an issue in politics that needs to be attacked on its own. Second is getting people to care about public service as a kind of goal for the future, which is really hard, as I mentioned earlier, given the material interests of young people these days, very difficult to do. But I think enough people, for example, my students at William and Mary, every day they tell me how much they want to do good in the world, how they'd like their lives to be lives of service. And there are many people like that around the world in modern democracies who would agree if we don't have the institutional capacity to handle climate change, to deal with the next pandemic, to deal with immigration issues, any number of issues which we all know are threatening the planet, then we're not going to be able to solve those problems. We're just not going to, as a species, be able to do it. So I think, you know, what we can do is get the rhetoric right. Don't accuse the patrimonial people of being anti-democratic every day, because, you know, their voters aren't going to like that very much. If you say, well, Trump is an anti-democrat, you idiot, you voted for him. Well, you know, you can understand that people who did say, well, you're just another of these elites telling me what I should think. And so this cycle continues. Whereas if you say what's going on is the destruction of the capacity of the state to do good in the world, some people can be won over to that.
Okay, Professor Hanson, thank you so very much for your time.
It was a great pleasure. I hope I answered all your questions.
Very much appreciated.
Okay, we'll be in touch.